Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Anyone who has ever lived in a quiet neighborhood knows how much you take the silence for granted. My little house on Birchwood Lane sat at the end of a cul-de-sac in rural Ohio, the kind of place where people wave from their porches and nobody locks their doors. I had moved there right after my divorce was finalized in the spring of 2023, needing somewhere cheap and peaceful to rebuild my life. At 34, with a nursing job at the county hospital and a fresh start ahead of me, I thought I had found exactly what I needed. The house was small, maybe 900 square feet, with peeling yellow paint and a backyard that backed up against a stretch of woods. My only neighbor was a man named Earl Pritchard, who lived about 50 yards to my left in a gray ranch-style home with an American flag hanging limp from his porch. For the first 3 months, we barely exchanged more than a nod. He seemed like a typical retired guy, maybe late 60s, always tinkering with something in his garage or sitting on his porch with a beer. I had no reason to think anything would ever go wrong. The problem started because of his dog, a massive Rottweiler mix named Duke that had to weigh at least 120 pounds. Earl let that animal roam free constantly. No leash, no fence, nothing to stop it from wandering wherever it pleased. The first few times Duke showed up in my yard, I just shooed him away and figured Earl would get the message. But then Duke started getting aggressive, barking and lunging at me when I tried to get to my own car in the morning. One Saturday in late August, I was bringing groceries in from my trunk when Duke came charging across the yard, teeth bared, hackles raised like a wild thing. I barely made it inside before he slammed against my screen door hard enough to dent the frame. That night, I called animal control and filed an official complaint. I remember feeling nervous about it, wondering if I was overreacting, but my hands had red scratches from scrambling to get inside, and my heart was still pounding hours later. I told myself I was just being a responsible neighbor, that Earl would understand once someone explained the rules to him. Looking at it now, I realized that phone call was the moment everything changed. Animal control came out 2 days later, on a Monday morning. I watched from my kitchen window as the officer spoke with Earl on his porch for maybe 10 minutes. Earl kept his arms crossed the whole time, his body rigid, occasionally gesturing toward my house with sharp, angry movements. When the officer left, Earl stood there staring at my window for a long moment before going back inside. I told myself it was fine, that he was just annoyed and would get over it. That night, Duke was finally on a chain in Earl's backyard, and I actually felt relieved, like the whole situation had been resolved with minimal drama. I went to bed early, exhausted from a double shift, and slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke up around 6 to get ready for work, made my coffee, and stepped out onto my front porch to check the weather like I always did. That was when I saw it. Sitting perfectly centered on top of my wooden fence post, right where my property met the road, was a small cardboard box. It was old and weathered, the kind you might find in someone's garage, and it was open at the top. Even from 20 feet away, I could see the dull brass glint of what was inside. I walked over slowly, my bare feet cold against the dewy grass, and when I got close enough to look inside, my breath caught in my throat. The box was filled with loose ammunition, maybe 40 or 50 rounds of what looked like shotgun shells mixed with smaller caliber bullets, all jumbled together like someone had dumped them from a drawer. There was no note, no explanation, nothing to indicate where it came from or why it was there. But I knew. I stood there in my pajamas, the morning birds singing like nothing was wrong, and I felt this cold knot form in my chest that would not go away for months. I took pictures with my phone, my fingers clumsy and stiff, then brought the box inside and set it on my kitchen counter. Part of me wanted to believe it was some kind of mistake, that maybe a hunter had left it there by accident or some teenagers were playing a prank. But the placement was too deliberate, too precise, right at the entrance to my property where I would absolutely see it first thing. I called in sick to work that day, something I almost never do, and spent the morning sitting at my kitchen table trying to decide what to do. By noon, I had convinced myself I was being paranoid. By evening, I knew I was not. I was watering the small patch of tomatoes I had planted near my back porch, trying to force some normalcy into my day, when I heard Earl's screen door slam shut. I looked up and saw him walking toward the fence line that separated our properties, moving with this slow, deliberate pace that made my stomach tighten. He stopped about 10 feet away from me, close enough that I could see the gray stubble on his jaw and the deep lines around his pale blue eyes. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he smiled, but it was the kind of smile that had no warmth in it whatsoever, just a slight pulling back of his lips that showed his yellowed teeth. His voice was calm, almost friendly, when he finally spoke. He said that he hoped I was settling in okay, that it was important for neighbors to look out for each other in a place this remote. Then he tilted his head slightly like he was studying me, and added that accidents happen when people stir up trouble, that it was real easy for things to go wrong when folks stuck their noses where they did not belong. He said it casually, the way you might comment on the weather, and then he just turned around and walked back to his house without waiting for me to respond. I stood there with the garden hose still running, water pooling around my feet, unable to move or think clearly for what felt like several minutes. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind against the windows made me sit up in bed with my heart hammering against my ribs. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something that pulled me fully awake, a rhythmic banging sound coming from somewhere outside. At first, I thought it might be a shutter or a loose piece of siding, but the rhythm was too steady, too intentional. I crept to my bedroom window and peered through the curtains, and what I saw made me press my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. Earl was in his backyard, illuminated by the glow of a work light he had set up on a ladder. He was hammering something onto a tall wooden post, working methodically despite the late hour. I watched him for maybe 20 minutes trying to understand what he was doing, until he finally stepped back, and I saw it clearly. He had installed a massive floodlight on that post, the industrial kind you see at construction sites, and it was angled directly at my house. Specifically, it was pointed straight at my bedroom window. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what I noticed when he turned to gather his tools. Strapped across his back, black metal gleaming under the work light, was a pump-action shotgun. He was not even trying to hide it. He wanted me to see. The next few days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and fear. That floodlight came on every single night at exactly 10:30, blazing through my curtains like a second sun, making it impossible to sleep without stuffing towels against the window frame and wearing a sleep mask. I bought blackout curtains from the hardware store in town, but even those could not fully block the intensity of that light. It was like living inside a fishbowl, knowing that at any moment he could be out there watching, that shotgun probably within arm's reach. I called the police on the 3rd day, explained everything from the ammunition, to the threat, to the floodlight situation. A deputy came out, a young guy named Fowler who seemed sympathetic but kept using phrases like civil matter, and no direct threat, and freedom to install lights on his own property. He said he would go talk to Earl, maybe encourage him to be more neighborly, but there was nothing illegal about outdoor lighting or owning firearms. I watched from my window as Deputy Fowler stood on Earl's porch for less than 5 minutes before driving away. That night, Earl added a second floodlight. This one was aimed at my driveway, so bright that it triggered the automatic sensor on my porch light and kept it burning all night long. My electricity bill that month was almost double what it usually was, but that felt like the least of my problems. I started changing my routines, leaving for work earlier and coming home later, parking on the far side of my house where the lights could not reach, entering through my back door like a thief in my own home. My coworkers noticed the dark circles under my eyes, the way I jumped at sudden noises, and I made up excuses about insomnia and stress from the divorce. How do you explain to someone that your neighbor is waging a silent war against you? that you are being terrorized in ways that do not technically break any laws. I thought about selling the house, but I had put every cent of my savings into the down payment, and the market in that area was terrible. I thought about confronting Earl directly, maybe appealing to whatever humanity might still exist in him, but every time I considered it, I remembered that cold smile and those words about accidents happening. One Thursday evening, I came home from a 12-hour shift to find a dead rabbit on my front steps. Its neck was clearly broken, the body still warm, and it had been placed right in front of my door with its glassy eyes staring up at the sky. There was no way to prove Earl had put it there. There was no way to prove anything. I buried the rabbit in my backyard with shaking hands and cried for the first time since this whole nightmare began. Not just from fear, but from the overwhelming helplessness of being trapped in a situation with no visible way out. 2 weeks passed in that same terrible pattern, the lights blazing every night, Earl appearing on his porch whenever I stepped outside, always with that shotgun cradled in his arms or propped against the railing within easy reach. He never said another word to me after that first warning, never needed to. His presence alone was the message, constant and suffocating, a reminder that he was watching and waiting for something I could not quite name. I installed security cameras, 4 of them covering every angle of my property, and started keeping a detailed log of every incident with dates and times and photographs. My phone was filled with hundreds of pictures of Earl standing on his porch, of the floodlights burning through the darkness, of Duke straining against his chain and barking furiously whenever I appeared. I showed everything to a lawyer in town, a woman named Gloria Ashworth who had been practicing for 30 years, and she told me the honest truth. Without a direct physical threat or actual violence, there was very little the law could do. I could try for a restraining order, but standing on your own porch with a legal firearm was not grounds for one. She suggested I document everything and hope he eventually crossed a line that would give me legal standing. Hope he crossed a line. As if I was supposed to wait for him to actually hurt me before anyone would take this seriously. It was a Saturday night in late September when things finally came to a head. I had gone to bed early, around 9, because the exhaustion had become so overwhelming that I could barely function. The blackout curtains were drawn tight, and I had earplugs in, my only defense against the nightly assault of light and anxiety. I do not know what time it was when the sound cut through my sleep, but I will never forget the way it felt to be ripped awake by the unmistakable crack of a gunshot. It was close, terrifyingly close, somewhere right behind my house near the tree line. I scrambled out of bed and crawled to the window, my whole body trembling as I pulled back the edge of the curtain just enough to see outside. The floodlights were on, painting everything in a harsh white light, and I could see Earl walking slowly back toward his house from the direction of my property line. The shotgun was in his hands, barrel pointed at the ground, and even from that distance I could see the faint wisp of smoke curling from the muzzle. He walked calmly, unhurried, like a man who had just finished a routine chore. When he reached his porch, he turned and looked directly at my window, and even though I knew he probably could not see me through the curtains, I felt completely exposed. He stood there for a long moment, then went inside and shut off the floodlights, plunging everything into darkness. I called 911 with fingers so unsteady I had to dial twice. 2 deputies arrived within 20 minutes, different ones this time, an older man named Sergeant Hartley, and a younger woman whose name I never caught. I told them everything, the whole story from the beginning, my voice cracking as I led them around back with a flashlight to show them where I thought the shot had come from. Sergeant Hartley found it almost immediately, a splintered hole in the wooden door of my garden shed, the edges still fresh and pale against the weathered gray paint. He dug the slug out with a pocket knife while his partner took photographs, and he confirmed it was from a 12-gauge shotgun, same type Earl carried openly every single day. But when they went to talk to Earl, he denied everything. Said he had been inside all night watching television, said he had not fired his weapon in weeks, said maybe someone else had come through the woods and taken a shot at a coyote or a deer. The deputies searched his property with his permission and found nothing incriminating. No spent shell casings, No recently fired weapon that they could test. Earl had clearly cleaned the shotgun and disposed of any evidence before they arrived. Sergeant Hartley told me he believed me, that he could see the pattern of harassment in everything I had documented, but believing and proving were two different things. Without witnesses or physical evidence linking Earl to the shot, there was nothing they could charge him with. He suggested I consider staying somewhere else for a while, maybe with family or friends, until things cooled down. I almost laughed at that. Things were never going to cool down. Earl had made that perfectly clear. The next morning I did something I probably should have done weeks earlier. I called my older brother Vincent, who lived about 4 hours away in Pennsylvania, and told him everything. He drove down that same day with his truck already loaded with boxes, and by sunset, we had packed up everything I owned and loaded it into a rental trailer. I did not bother trying to sell the house through normal channels. I contacted a company that buys properties fast for cash, took a loss of almost $40,000, and signed the papers 3 days later. It felt like surrender, like Earl had won, and in a way I suppose he had. But I also knew that staying there meant waiting for something worse to happen, something that might not leave me alive to file another police report. The last time I saw Earl Pritchard, he was standing on his porch with that shotgun resting against his shoulder, watching Vincent and me load the final boxes into the truck. He did not say a word, did not wave or smile or make any gesture at all. He just watched with those pale blue eyes, his face completely blank, as I climbed into the passenger seat and we pulled away from Birchwood Lane for the last time. I moved in with Vincent and his wife temporarily, found a new nursing job 2 months later, and eventually bought a small condo in a busy suburb, where my neighbors are separated by walls and I can hear the comforting sounds of traffic at night. I still check the locks 3 times before bed. I still flinch at loud noises. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see that wisp of smoke curling from the barrel of his gun and feel his gaze fixed on my window through the darkness. Buying my first house felt like crossing some invisible finish line that everyone kept talking about. Most of my co-workers at the insurance company had already done it, and after 6 years as a claims adjuster in Northern Ohio, I finally had enough saved for a down payment. The place was nothing fancy, a small 2-bedroom on Ridgemont Drive with a detached garage and a yard that needed serious attention. But it was mine. The neighborhood seemed quiet enough when I visited during the day. Older homes, mature trees, the kind of street where people still waved from their porches. I moved in on a Saturday in early March of 2022, and by Sunday afternoon, I had already met the man who would spend the next 8 months trying to destroy my life. His name was Gerald Fitch, and he lived in the pale yellow house directly to my left, separated from my property by a weathered wooden fence that leaned slightly toward my side. The fence became our first battlefield, though I did not know it would be a war. During my initial walkthrough with the realtor, she had mentioned that the fence was technically on the property line. Shared responsibility, she said. Nothing unusual. A few posts had rotted at the base and one section sagged badly enough that you could see straight into Gerald's backyard. My second week in the house, I knocked on his door to introduce myself and discuss splitting the repair cost. Gerald answered wearing a tucked-in polo shirt despite it being a cold Wednesday evening, his gray hair combed back with precision, wire-rimmed glasses sitting low on a nose that looked like it had been broken more than once. He must have been somewhere in his early 60s. He listened to my proposal without blinking, then told me the fence was entirely my problem because it leaned toward my property. When I tried to explain how property lines worked, he simply closed the door in my face. I stood there on his porch for a good 10 seconds, genuinely unsure if that had actually just happened. I decided to fix the fence myself and move on with my life. Paid a contractor $800 to replace the rotted posts and straighten the whole thing out. It looked great when they finished, fresh cedar planks, everything level and solid. I thought that would be the end of it. Instead, it was the beginning. 3 days after the fence was done, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no stamp, no return address. Inside was a handwritten note on yellow legal paper, the penmanship tight and slanted. It accused me of trespassing on Gerald's property during the repair, claimed the new fence was 2 inches over the line, and demanded I remove it immediately or face legal action. I walked outside and stared at the fence, then at his house. His blinds moved slightly and I knew he was watching. That night I heard something that would become painfully familiar over the coming months. A slow, deliberate knocking on my front door at exactly 11:45. When I opened the door, nobody was there, just the empty porch and the sound of crickets. I checked the sides of the house, walked halfway down the driveway, saw nothing. Went back inside and tried to convince myself it was kids messing around. But the next night, same time, same knock. 3 heavy thuds against the wood, spaced about 2 seconds apart. This time I moved faster, yanked the door open while the sound was still echoing. The porch light showed me an empty concrete slab and my own car parked in the driveway. I looked toward Gerald's house and noticed his garage door was slightly open, maybe 6 inches off the ground, though it had been fully closed when I came home from work. I stood there watching it, waiting for movement, my heart beating in my throat. After a full minute of nothing, I went back inside and locked the deadbolt. I did not sleep well that night, or any night that followed for a very long time. The code violations started arriving in April. The first one came from the city, a formal notice claiming my grass had exceeded the maximum allowed height of 8 inches. I had mowed 2 days earlier. The lawn was maybe 4 inches at most. I called the code enforcement office and spoke to a woman named Ruth who sounded exhausted before I even explained my situation. She told me complaints were filed anonymously, that they were obligated to investigate each one, and that I should just make sure I was in compliance. A week later, another notice, this time about my trash cans being visible from the street on a non-collection day. I had left them by the garage for maybe 3 hours after bringing in groceries. The fines were small, $25 here, $40 there, but they accumulated. By the end of May, I had received 9 separate complaints. My car was parked too close to the curb. My porch light was too bright. A broken window screen was an eyesore. I replaced the screen the same day I got that notice, and the following morning I found a dead crow on my welcome mat, its neck bent at a horrible angle. I started keeping a journal of everything. Dates, times, details of each incident. My buddy Vince from work told me I needed documentation if this ever went to court. And he was right. June brought a new kind of harassment. I would come home from work to find small things moved around my property. Nothing stolen, just rearranged. The garden hose coiled in the opposite direction. My garbage can switched positions. A potted plant I kept on the porch steps relocated to the other side. Each thing was minor on its own, almost unnoticeable, but the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was entering my property while I was gone, touching my belongings, letting me know they had been there. I mentioned it to the neighbor on my right, a retired schoolteacher named Dolores, who had lived on Ridgemont Drive for 30 years. She listened carefully, then lowered her voice and told me that Gerald had done the same thing to the previous owners. They lasted 14 months before selling the house at a loss and leaving the state. I installed cameras the first week of July. 4 of them, one covering the front porch, one aimed at the driveway, one watching the backyard, and one pointed directly at the fence line between my property and Gerald's. The system cost me nearly $600, but I figured it was worth every penny if it meant catching him in the act. For the first few days, nothing happened. No knocking, no moved objects, no dead animals. I started to wonder if the cameras alone had been enough to scare him off. Then I woke up on a Friday morning to find all 4 feeds showing static. I went outside in my bathrobe, coffee still in hand, and discovered that someone had cut the wiring on every single camera. Clean cuts, precise, clearly done with wire cutters or a sharp blade. The cables ran along the exterior walls of my house, tucked against the siding, and whoever did this had taken their time. They had climbed onto my roof to reach the backyard camera. I called the police and filed a report. The officer who showed up was polite but uninterested. He wrote down what I told him, glanced at Gerald's house once, then explained that without footage of the actual vandalism, There was nothing they could do. That same weekend, I found the first nail behind my tire. It was a 3-inch framing nail, the kind you buy in bulk at hardware stores, positioned perfectly behind my rear driver's side wheel. If I had backed out without looking, it would have punctured the tire within seconds. I photographed it, added it to my journal, and started checking my car every morning before work. Over the next 3 weeks, I found 7 more nails in various spots around my vehicle. Behind tires, under the car, once balanced on top of my windshield wiper like a message. I bought a cheap dash cam that recorded to an internal memory card, hoping to catch something, but the angle only covered what was directly in front of the car. Meanwhile, the nighttime knocking returned. Always between 11:30 and midnight, always 3 slow thuds, always nobody there when I opened the door. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed. My appetite disappeared. I lost 12 pounds in 6 weeks and had to punch a new hole in my belt just to keep my pants up. The message appeared on a Monday in late August. I had taken the day off work to deal with some paperwork and spent most of the morning inside with the blinds closed, trying to ignore the fact that I could feel Gerald watching my house from his windows. Around 2 in the afternoon, I went out to check the mail and decided to walk along the fence line to see if there was any new damage. That was when I saw it. Carved into the wood on my side of the fence, directly facing my bedroom window, were 4 words that stopped me cold. Move or bleed. The letters were deep, gouged into the cedar with something sharp, each one about 6 inches tall. The wood shavings were still fresh on the ground, pale and curled like tiny bones. He had done this recently, probably while I was inside, maybe even while I was eating lunch 10 feet away. I took pictures from every angle, my hands trembling so badly that half the shots came out blurred. Then I called the police again and waited 45 minutes for a cruiser to show up. The officer this time was different from the first one. Younger, with a shaved head and a bored expression that never changed no matter what I showed him. He looked at the carving, took a few notes, and asked if I had any proof that my neighbor had done it. I explained the history, the complaints, the cameras, the nails, all of it. He nodded slowly and said this sounded like a civil dispute, that I should consider talking to a lawyer about a restraining order. When I pointed out that the message was clearly a threat, he shrugged and said it could be interpreted different ways. Maybe it was a warning about something else entirely. Maybe someone was playing a prank. I asked him what possible interpretation of move or bleed was not threatening, and he just told me to call if anything else happened. I watched him drive away and felt something shift inside me. The police were not going to help. The city did not care. I was completely alone in this, and Gerald knew it. That night, I saw him standing in his backyard for the first time since this all began. He was perfectly still, facing my house, holding what looked like a long metal pipe in his right hand. We stared at each other across the fence for what must have been 5 minutes. Then he smiled, turned around, and walked back inside. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing for something I hoped would never come. Bought new cameras, this time wireless ones that uploaded directly to a cloud server. No wires to cut. Installed motion sensor floodlights on every corner of the house. Replaced the locks on all my doors with heavy-duty deadbolts, and added a security bar to the sliding glass door in the back. I also did something I never thought I would do. I bought a gun. A 9mm handgun from a shop 20 miles outside of town, along with a box of ammunition and 3 hours of lessons at their indoor range. I hated the weight of it in my hand, hated what it represented, but I hated the idea of being defenseless even more. Vince helped me file for a restraining order, and we gathered every piece of documentation I had collected since March. The journal entries, the photographs, the police reports, the code violation notices. A judge granted a temporary order in early September, which meant Gerald was legally required to stay at least 500 feet from me. The night after he was served, I heard him screaming in his backyard. Not words, just raw sound, like an animal caught in a trap. I lay in bed listening to it, gripping that pistol under my pillow, waiting for the crash of breaking glass that I was certain would come. The crash never came. What came instead was silence. For 3 days, Gerald did not leave his house. His car stayed in the driveway, his blinds stayed closed, his porch light stayed off. I kept waiting for the next nail, the next knock, the next carved message. Nothing. On the 4th day, I saw an ambulance parked in front of his house when I came home from work. 2 paramedics were wheeling a stretcher through his front door, and on it was Gerald, strapped down and motionless. Dolores was standing on her lawn watching, and she told me that his daughter had found him unconscious on the kitchen floor. Stroke, apparently. Massive. He survived, but barely. I learned later from a mutual neighbor that he was moved to a long-term care facility somewhere downstate, unable to walk or speak. His daughter put the house up for sale a month later. I never saw Gerald Fitch again. Sometimes I drive past that facility when I am in the area, and I slow down just a little, wondering if he is still in there, still aware, still remembering the man next door he tried so hard to break. The new neighbors are a young couple with a toddler. They wave when they see me. I wave back, but I have never taken down the cameras, and I still check behind my tires every single morning before I leave for work. Some habits, once learned, are impossible to forget. Nobody warns you about the smell of old apartment buildings until you are already signing the lease. That was my situation in early March of 2023, standing in the cramped office of the Belmont Gardens complex in Columbus, Ohio, handing over my deposit check to a woman named Faye, who had inch-long acrylic nails painted with tiny American flags. I had just turned 26 the week before, celebrating alone with a cupcake from the grocery store, because everyone I knew still lived back in Michigan, and I had taken this accounting job specifically to get away from my ex-fiancé and his new girlfriend. The apartment was Unit 4C on the top floor of a 5-story building constructed sometime in the 1960s, with those textured ceilings that look like popcorn and radiators that clang like someone is trapped inside them. Faye told me the place had good bones, whatever that means, and that most tenants stayed for years. She also mentioned the man in 4B had been there the longest, almost a decade, and kept to himself, which she framed as a positive. I remember thinking that sounded perfect because the last thing I needed was a chatty neighbor asking about my life when I was still trying to figure out what my life even was anymore. His name was Gregory Vance, and I met him exactly once during my first 2 weeks in the building. It was a Sunday morning around 7, and I was dragging my laundry basket down to the basement machines when he came out of 4B carrying 2 large black garbage bags that looked heavy enough to make his shoulders strain. He was maybe 50, with a narrow face and deep-set eyes that reminded me of a bird, something predatory like a hawk or a falcon. His hair was cropped short, military style, and he wore latex gloves, which I thought was odd for taking out trash. I said good morning and he responded with a sound that was not quite a word, more like an acknowledgement that I existed, before heading toward the back stairwell that led to the parking lot. What stuck with me was not his unfriendliness, plenty of people are not morning people, but the smell that followed him down the hallway. It was sharp and chemical, like industrial cleaning solution, but underneath it was something else, something rotten that the chemicals were trying to mask. I told myself he probably had a cat that had an accident, or maybe he was cleaning out old food from his fridge. Normal explanations for abnormal smells. The kind of logic you use when you do not want to think too hard about your neighbors. The smell became a constant presence over the following weeks, drifting through the heating vent that connected our 2 units. My bedroom shared a wall with what I assumed was his living room, and the vent sat low near the baseboard, a rectangular metal grate that had been painted over so many times the screws were practically sealed shut. Some nights the odor was barely noticeable, just a faint whiff of bleach when the heat kicked on. Other nights it was so strong I had to sleep with my window cracked open, even when the temperature dropped into the 30s. I bought 3 different air fresheners, lavender, vanilla, something called Ocean Breeze that smelled nothing like any ocean I had ever visited, and lined them up on my dresser like soldiers defending against an invisible enemy. My coworker Jill suggested I complain to management, But I kept putting it off because I did not want to be that neighbor, the one who causes problems before she has even been there a full month. Besides, Faye had made it clear during the lease signing that Gregory Vance was a model tenant who always paid on time and never caused issues. I figured whatever was happening in his apartment was his business, not mine. What I could not ignore was the noise. It started around the third week of March, always between 3 and 4 in the morning. A heavy dragging sound that came through the wall like someone was pulling furniture across the floor. The first time it woke me, I lay there in the dark with my heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just the building settling, or maybe pipes expanding in the walls. But pipes do not drag. Pipes do not stop and stop again like something heavy is being repositioned. I would hear it for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, then silence, then the sound of his front door opening and closing. From my bedroom window, I could see the parking lot below, and I started watching for him on those nights. This pale figure in dark clothes loading those same black garbage bags into the trunk of a beige sedan that looked like it had not been washed in years. He always drove away before dawn and came back empty-handed around 7, just as the early risers in the building were leaving for work. I told myself he was probably a night shift janitor, or maybe worked at a meat processing plant, something that would explain both the hours and the smell. I was very good at telling myself things back then, constructing explanations that let me go back to sleep. April came with warmer weather, and a building-wide notice taped to everyone's door announcing a plumbing inspection scheduled for the 15th. Apparently, there had been complaints about slow drains and low water pressure on the upper floors, and management was sending someone to check all the units. I remember feeling relieved because it meant someone official would be entering Gregory's apartment, someone who might notice if anything was wrong in there. The inspection was set for a Saturday, and I made sure to be home, finding excuses to linger in my kitchen with the door cracked open so I could hear what was happening in the hallway. The maintenance worker was a young guy named Danny, who looked barely out of high school, with a patchy beard and a toolbox that seemed too heavy for his skinny arms. He started on the first floor and worked his way up, knocking on doors and spending maybe 15 minutes in each unit. When he got to the 4th floor around 2 in the afternoon, I watched through my peephole as he knocked on 4B. Gregory answered after a long pause, and I could only see a sliver of his face through the gap, but something about his posture looked tense, coiled, like an animal that does not want to let a stranger into its territory. Danny was inside 4B for almost 40 minutes, way longer than any other unit. I pretended to wash dishes, then pretended to organize my pantry, all while straining to hear anything through the wall. There were muffled voices, the clang of pipes being tested, and then silence for a stretch that felt endless. When Danny finally emerged, his face had changed. The casual boredom he had carried from unit to unit was gone, replaced by something tight around his eyes and mouth, like he was working hard to keep his expression neutral. He knocked on my door next, and when I let him in, his hands were not quite steady as he checked my bathroom sink and shower drain. I asked him if everything was okay, trying to sound casual, and he gave me this look that I still think about sometimes. A look that said he wanted to tell me something but could not find the words, or maybe did not have the authority. What he actually said was that the building had some older pipes that needed attention, nothing urgent. But as he was packing up his tools, he muttered something under his breath that I almost missed. He said, "That guy next door, his drain, there was something in it." I asked him what he meant, and he just shook his head and said it was probably nothing, probably just rust or old residue. But the way he said probably made it sound like he did not believe it himself. That night I could not sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the old building, hyper-aware of the walls separating me from 4B. Around 1 in the morning, I heard Gregory's door open and close, followed by his footsteps heading toward the back stairwell. I got up and went to my window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the parking lot. There he was, same dark clothes, same hunched posture, loading not 1 but 3 garbage bags into his trunk. They looked heavier than usual, and he struggled with the last one, having to shift his grip twice before he could swing it into the car. I watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing down the street, and I stood there for a long time after he was gone, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floor. Something had shifted in my mind that day, some barrier between normal and not normal that I had been carefully maintaining. Danny's face when he came out of that apartment, the way his hands trembled when he checked my drains, the thing he almost told me but did not, all of it was circling in my head like water that would not go down. I went back to bed, but I did not close my eyes. I just waited for the sound of his car returning, which it did around 5:30, the engine cutting off in the pre-dawn quiet. The police showed up 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning when I was getting ready for work. I heard the knock on Gregory's door first, firm and official, the kind of knock that does not take no for an answer. I crept to my peephole and saw 2 officers in uniform, a man and a woman, standing in the hallway with their hands resting on their belts. Gregory opened his door only a few inches, and I could hear fragments of their conversation, words like complaints and disturbance, and just routine questions. His voice was calm, almost eerily so, like he had been expecting this and had rehearsed his answers. The officers did not seem satisfied, but they also did not push their way in, and after maybe 10 minutes they moved on to knock on my door. I opened it with what I hoped was a confused expression, the innocent neighbor who had no idea what was happening. The female officer, whose name tag read Nunez, asked if I had heard any strange noises coming from 4B, particularly at night. I hesitated for just a second too long, and I saw her eyes sharpen, catching that pause. I told her about the dragging sounds, about the odd hours Gregory kept, about the smell that came through my vent. She wrote everything down in a small notebook, her pen moving in quick strokes. And when she looked up at me, there was something in her expression that made my throat tight. She thanked me for my time and told me to call if I noticed anything else, handing me a card with her direct number. After they left, I stood in my doorway and watched them knock on 4A, then head downstairs to continue their rounds. Gregory's door stayed shut, but I could feel him in there, just on the other side of that thin wall, listening. I called in sick to work that day because there was no way I could concentrate on spreadsheets and budget reports with everything that was happening. Instead, I sat on my couch with the blinds half closed, watching the hallway through my peephole every time I heard footsteps. Gregory did not leave his apartment all morning. Around noon, I heard sounds coming through the wall, drawers opening and closing, the thump of objects being moved around, a rhythm that sounded frantic and purposeful at the same time. He was packing. I knew it with a certainty that sat heavy in my chest. The same way you know a storm is coming before you see the clouds. I thought about calling Officer Nunez, but I did not know what I would say. My neighbor is moving things around in his apartment? That was not a crime. That was not even suspicious. Not really. Not in a way I could put into words without sounding paranoid. So I just waited, my phone in my hand with her number pulled up on the screen, my thumb hovering over the call button like it was a trigger I was not ready to pull. The sounds continued for hours, and somewhere around 3 in the afternoon, I heard the unmistakable noise of a suitcase with wheels being rolled across a hardwood floor. He left at 4:17. I know the exact time because I was watching the clock on my microwave when I heard his door open. I rushed to my peephole and saw him standing in the hallway with a single black rolling suitcase and a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead, something I had never seen him wear before, like he was trying to hide his face. What made me hold my breath was the way he looked at my door before he turned toward the stairwell. A long, deliberate stare that seemed to last forever, even though it was probably only a few seconds. It was like he knew I was watching. Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the stairs, and a minute later I heard a car engine start in the parking lot. I ran to my window just in time to see his beige sedan pull out of its spot and turn onto the main road, heading north toward the highway. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my temples. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, staring at the empty parking spot where his car had been, before I noticed something that made the air feel thin in my lungs. His apartment door, the door to 4B, was still slightly open, Not all the way, just an inch or two, like he had been in such a hurry that he forgot to pull it shut behind him, or like he did not care anymore whether it was locked. I told myself I was not going to go in there. I said it out loud, actually, standing in my kitchen with my back pressed against the refrigerator like it could somehow anchor me to sanity. This was a matter for the police, not for a 26-year-old accountant who had only lived in this building for 6 weeks. I should call Officer Nunez, report that Gregory had fled, let the professionals handle whatever was behind that door. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing, the thing any reasonable person would do. But the door was right there, maybe 15 feet from my own, and it was open, and I had been smelling whatever was in that apartment for weeks now, waking up to dragging sounds at 3 in the morning, watching him load those heavy bags into his trunk, like a man with something to hide. I needed to know. The not knowing had been eating at me since the day I moved in, this constant low-grade anxiety that lived in the back of my skull, and now the answer was just a few steps away. I grabbed my phone, made sure it was charged, and walked to my door before I could talk myself out of it. The hallway was empty and silent, the late afternoon light filtering through the window at the end of the corridor, making everything look gold and somehow wrong. The smell hit me before I even pushed the door all the way open. It was the same chemical odor I had been breathing through my vent for weeks, but concentrated now, so thick it felt like a physical presence. Underneath it was something worse, something sweet and rotten that made my eyes water and my gag reflex kick in. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and stepped inside, my free hand already reaching for my phone to dial 911. The apartment was laid out exactly like mine, but mirrored, with the kitchen to my right and the living room straight ahead. It was almost completely empty, no furniture except for a folding chair and a small table against the far wall. The floors were bare, the walls were bare, and every surface had a strange sheen to it, like it had been wiped down recently with something industrial. But it was the coffee table that stopped me in my tracks, that made me forget how to breathe for a moment. Spread across its surface were photographs, maybe 20 or 30 of them, printed on regular paper and arranged in neat rows like someone had been studying them. They were all women. Different ages, different faces, but all of them photographed without their knowledge. Walking down streets, getting into cars, standing in grocery store parking lots. And next to the photographs was a stack of missing person flyers, the same ones I had seen stapled to telephone poles around the neighborhood. The same faces that had been staring at me from the bulletin board at the laundromat down the street. I do not remember dialing 911, but I must have, because suddenly there was a voice in my ear asking what my emergency was. I backed out of the apartment without touching anything else, my legs moving on autopilot while my brain tried to process what I had just seen. The operator kept me on the line, her voice calm and professional, asking me questions I could barely answer. Within 8 minutes, there were 4 police cars in the parking lot and officers swarming the 4th floor, their radios crackling with codes I did not understand. Officer Nunez arrived shortly after, and when she saw me sitting on the hallway floor with my back against my own door, she crouched down and put a hand on my shoulder without saying anything. The forensic team went into 4B wearing gloves and masks and full protective suits, and they were in there for hours, carrying out evidence bags and taking photographs of every surface. I learned later that they found more than just the pictures on the coffee table. In the bathroom, behind a false panel under the sink, there were jewelry and personal items belonging to at least 7 different women, rings, watches, a locket with a photograph inside, a keychain with a small stuffed bear attached. The drain that Danny had inspected contained traces of human blood, enough to confirm that something terrible had happened in that apartment, probably more than once. Gregory Vance was arrested 4 days later at a motel outside of Indianapolis, about 3 hours from Columbus. The news coverage was relentless for weeks. Reporters camped outside our building, neighbors I had never spoken to suddenly giving interviews about the quiet man in 4B who always kept to himself. They found his car in a wooded area about 20 miles from the motel, and in the trunk were more garbage bags containing evidence I cannot bring myself to describe, even now. He was charged with the murders of 5 women, all of them from the Columbus area. all of them reported missing over the past 3 years. The trial is still pending as I write this, and I have been told I will likely be called as a witness. I moved out of Belmont Gardens the week after his arrest, breaking my lease without a second thought, and I have not been back since. Some nights I still wake up at 3 in the morning, my body tensed for a sound that is not coming anymore, and I lie there in the dark thinking about how thin the walls were between us. I think about how I rationalized the smell, the noises, the heavy bags, how badly I wanted everything to be normal that I almost convinced myself it was. And I think about the photographs on that coffee table, all those women who had no idea they were being watched, and I wonder if there was ever a photograph of me in that stack, taken on some ordinary day when I thought I was just living my life. I will probably never know the answer to that question, and maybe that is for the best. My girlfriend and I had been splitting rent for almost 5 years when she decided Portland was too rainy and too boring, and that some guy she met at a yoga retreat was neither of those things. So there I was, 10 years out of high school, signing a lease on a small 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. It was the kind of street where people waved from their driveways and left Christmas decorations up until February. The house itself was nothing special. Beige siding, a patchy front lawn, a creaky back porch, but it was mine. I remember pulling into the driveway that first Saturday morning in March of 2023, my Subaru packed with everything I owned, feeling that strange mix of freedom and loneliness that comes with starting over. The moving truck was supposed to arrive by noon, and I was already sweating through my shirt trying to haul boxes from my car when I heard someone call out from the yard next door. His name was Leonard Marsh, and he came jogging over before I even had a chance to set down the box I was carrying. He looked to be somewhere in his mid-50s, with thinning gray hair combed neatly to one side, and the kind of pale blue eyes that seemed just a little too focused when he looked at you. He was wearing khaki shorts and a tucked-in polo shirt despite the fact that it was barely 60 degrees outside. Leonard shook my hand firmly, maybe a beat too long, and told me how glad he was to finally have someone in the house. Said it had been empty for almost 8 months, and that empty houses attracted the wrong kind of attention. He offered to help me unload, and before I could politely decline, he was already grabbing a box from my trunk. I remember thinking he was just one of those overly friendly neighbor types, the kind who brings casseroles and knows everyone's business. He carried 3 boxes inside, commented on how the previous owner had left the place in decent shape, and told me to knock on his door if I ever needed anything. Anything at all, he said. He repeated that last part twice. The first few weeks went by without incident, and I started to settle into a routine. I worked as a software tester for a company downtown, which meant leaving around 7:30 in the morning and getting back around 6 most evenings. Leonard seemed to have a sixth sense for when I was coming or going. Every single time I pulled into the driveway, he would appear, sometimes from his garage, sometimes from his front porch, sometimes just walking down his lawn like he had been waiting there. He always had something to say, how the mailman had left a package by my side gate, how he noticed my kitchen light was on all night, how the lawn service had come by but I might want to talk to them about the edging near the fence. I thanked him each time, smiled politely, and hurried inside. My buddy Cole, who I had known since college, came over one Friday night to watch basketball, and when I mentioned Leonard, Cole just laughed and said I had won the lottery. A neighbor who actually paid attention was rare these days. I wanted to believe that, I really did. It was maybe 3 weeks after I moved in when the small things started adding up. I came home one Wednesday to find an Amazon package sitting on my kitchen counter instead of on the front porch where it should have been. I stood there staring at it for a good minute, trying to remember if I had left the door unlocked, if maybe the delivery driver had some special instruction I forgot about. Then my phone buzzed with a text from Leonard. Saw the delivery guy leave your package outside, didn't want it to get stolen, so I brought it in for you. Hope that's okay. I had never given Leonard a key. I had never told him he could enter my house. I typed back a quick thanks, but my fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long time before I hit send. That night, I walked through every room, checking the windows, checking the back door, trying to find any sign of how he had gotten in. Everything was locked. Everything was exactly as I had left it, except for that box sitting on my counter like it belonged there. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the previous tenant had given him a spare key and he just never mentioned it. Maybe he had a locksmith friend, or knew some trick with old doorknobs. I even called my landlord, a woman named Georgina, who lived 2 hours away in Raleigh, and asked if she had ever given a key to anyone in the neighborhood. She said no, sounded confused by the question, and reminded me that the locks had been changed before I moved in. That should have made me feel better. It did not. The following Saturday, Leonard knocked on my door around noon holding a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil. He said his wife Patty had made too much lasagna and thought I might want some since I was living alone and probably not eating right. I took the dish and thanked him, and he just stood there in my doorway, leaning slightly to the left like he was trying to see past me into the living room. He asked if I had finished unpacking yet, if I had set up the spare bedroom, if I was thinking about getting a dog for company. Each question felt like a probe, like he was fishing for information. I answered vaguely and said I had to get back to cleaning, and he nodded slowly before turning to leave. Right before he stepped off the porch, he looked back and said, "You know, your living room would look a lot less empty if you moved that TV stand to the wall by the window. Better light that way." I had not invited Leonard inside since moving day. I had not shown him the living room. I had not discussed furniture placement or where I kept my television. Yet he described the exact layout of my space like he had been standing in it recently, like he had walked through and taken notes. I closed the door and locked it, then stood with my back against it, heart pounding in my ears. The lasagna sat on the counter untouched. I threw it away that night, dish and all, and felt guilty about it for reasons I could not explain. The next morning, I went to the hardware store and bought a chain lock for the front door and a sliding bolt for the back. The guy at the register asked if I was having trouble with break-ins, and I just shrugged and said I wanted to be careful. When I got home, Leonard was in his front yard trimming hedges that did not need trimming, and he watched me carry the bag inside without saying a word. His expression was neutral, almost pleasant, but his eyes tracked me the entire way from my car to my door. That night, I slept with the bedroom door locked for the first time since I was a kid afraid of monsters. Only now, the monster lived 30 feet away and knew exactly what was inside my house. 2 days passed without any contact from Leonard, and I started to wonder if maybe I had imagined the whole thing, if the stress of the move and the breakup had turned me paranoid. Then I came home on a Thursday evening and found my front door cracked open about 2 inches. I stood on the porch for a long moment, keys still in my hand, listening for any sound from inside. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant bark of a dog somewhere down the street. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside, checking every room, every closet, every shadow. The house was empty. Nothing was missing, nothing was disturbed, but the chain lock I had installed, the one I had fastened that very morning, was hanging loose, the screws pulled clean out of the frame like someone had yanked it with force. I called Cole and asked him to come over, and he sat with me while I filed a police report. The officer who showed up was a young guy named Reeves, polite but clearly skeptical. He walked through the house, checked the back door, looked at the damaged chain lock, and asked if I had any enemies or ex-girlfriends who might want to mess with me. I told him about Leonard, about the packages, about the comments on my furniture. He wrote it all down but said there was not much he could do without evidence of a crime. "Sounds like you just have a nosy neighbor," he said on his way out. "Might want to get a camera." So I got a camera. I ordered one of those indoor security cameras that connects to your phone, the kind that sends you alerts whenever it detects motion. I set it up in my living room, angled toward the front door, and tested it a dozen times to make sure the view was right. For the first few days, everything was normal. I would check the app during my lunch break and see an empty room, The same couch, the same TV stand, the same afternoon light filtering through the blinds. I started to relax a little. Maybe Officer Reeves was right. Maybe Leonard was just a lonely old man with boundary issues, and I was letting my imagination run wild. Then Friday came. I remember the exact moment because I was in a meeting at work, my phone buzzing in my pocket with a motion alert. I ignored it at first, figured it was just a shadow or a car passing by outside. But then another alert came, and another. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway, opening the app with a growing sense of dread. The camera feed showed my living room, just like always, except the lens was pointed straight down at the floor. Someone had turned it. Someone had been inside my house, seen the camera, and deliberately angled it away so it would not record them. The timestamp said 2:47 in the afternoon, right in the middle of the workday, right when Leonard knew I would be gone. I left work early that day, telling my manager I had a family emergency. When I pulled into my driveway, Leonard was sitting on his front porch in a wicker chair, a glass of iced tea in his hand, watching me like he had been expecting me. I did not wave. I did not acknowledge him. I went straight inside and locked every door, then walked through the house looking for anything out of place. The camera was exactly as the app had shown, tilted down, pointing at nothing but hardwood floor. But this time, there was something else. Muddy footprints. A trail of them leading from the back door through the kitchen and into the living room, then back the same way. The mud was still damp, reddish-brown, the kind of clay soil you find in backyards around here after a good rain. It had rained the night before. I followed the prints to the back door and saw that the sliding bolt I had installed was still in place, still locked from the inside. But the window next to it, the small one above the sink that I never thought to secure, was open about 4 inches, just wide enough for someone to reach through and unlock the door from inside. I stood there staring at that window, at those footprints, and felt something cold settle into my chest. He had found another way in. No matter what I did, he kept finding another way in. That night, around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it and felt the air leave my lungs. "Are you traveling again this weekend? Just want to make sure your place stays safe." It was Leonard. I had never given him my phone number. I had never told him I traveled, because I did not. I had not left town since moving in. But he knew my schedule. He knew when I was home and when I was not. He knew the layout of my house, the contents of my cabinets, the angle of my camera. I scrolled up to see if there were any previous messages, but the thread was empty except for that single text, sitting there like a threat wrapped in neighborly concern. I did not respond. I sat on my couch in the dark, every light in the house turned off, watching through the blinds as Leonard's porch light glowed across the yard. Around 11, I saw his silhouette pass by his front window. He paused there for a moment, and even though I could not see his face, I knew he was looking at my house. I knew he could see that my lights were off, that my car was in the driveway, that I was home and awake and terrified. The silhouette moved away, and his house went dark. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my living room with a kitchen knife on the cushion beside me, waiting for a sound that never came. The next morning, I made a decision. I was not going to wait for something worse to happen. I called Georgina and told her I needed to break the lease, that there was a situation with a neighbor that made me feel unsafe. She was understanding, said she had dealt with difficult tenant situations before, and agreed to let me out without penalty, as long as I gave her 2 weeks to find a replacement. Then I called Cole and asked if I could crash on his couch until I found a new place. He said yes without hesitation, and by noon I was packing everything I owned into boxes for the second time in 2 months. I worked fast, throwing clothes into garbage bags, wrapping dishes in newspaper, dismantling furniture I had only just assembled. Every few minutes I glanced out the window, expecting to see Leonard watching from his yard, but his house was quiet. His car was gone from the driveway. I did not know where he was, and that scared me almost as much as knowing. By 4 o'clock, My Subaru was loaded to the roof and a rental trailer was hitched to the back. I did one last walkthrough of the empty house, checking every room, every closet, every window. The place looked exactly as it had when I first arrived. Bare walls, dusty floors, afternoon light slanting through the blinds. I locked the front door, slid the key through the mail slot, and turned to leave. Leonard was standing at the edge of my driveway. I do not know how long he had been there. He was wearing the same khaki shorts and tucked-in polo shirt from the day we met, his hands clasped in front of him like a funeral director. His pale blue eyes moved slowly from my face to the loaded car to the rental trailer, taking it all in. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice soft and almost hurt, like a parent disappointed in a child. I did not answer. I walked past him, close enough to smell the faint scent of soap and something else underneath it, something stale and wrong. He did not move to stop me, did not reach out or block my path, but I felt his gaze on me the entire way to my car. As I opened the driver's door, he spoke again. "You know, the last tenant left in a hurry too. And the one before that." He smiled then, a small, satisfied expression that did not reach his eyes. "But someone always comes back. Someone always moves in." I got in my car, started the engine, and pulled out of that driveway without looking back. I watched him shrink in my rearview mirror until I turned the corner and he disappeared from sight. That was 8 months ago. I live on the other side of Charlotte now, in an apartment complex with security cameras in the hallways and neighbors I have never spoken to. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that house on Waverly Court. I think about Leonard Marsh and his wife Patty and that casserole dish I threw away. I think about the muddy footprints and the tilted camera and the text message asking if I was traveling. And I wonder who lives there now, in that quiet little house with the beige siding and the creaky back porch. I wonder if Leonard has introduced himself yet. I wonder if he has offered to help. Chester was the kind of dog who made strangers smile on the sidewalk. My golden retriever had been my constant companion since I adopted him from a shelter right after finishing my MBA in 2017. 7 years of morning runs, lazy Sundays, and that ridiculous way he would press his nose against the window whenever I pulled into the driveway. I had moved to a quiet neighborhood in Northern Virginia about 2 years prior, a modest house on Fernwood Circle, with a decent-sized backyard and a wooden fence that gave Chester plenty of room to explore. Life was predictable in the best way. My job as a financial analyst kept me busy during the week, Chester kept me sane, and the neighbors mostly kept to themselves. That all changed on a Wednesday morning in early September 2024, when I let Chester out for his usual backyard routine and watched him sprint toward his favorite corner near the fence like he always did. I was standing at the kitchen counter, pouring my second cup of coffee, when I heard a sound I had never heard before. It was somewhere between a whimper and a gag, this awful wet noise that made me abandon my mug mid-pour and rush to the back door. Chester was near the fence line, his whole body convulsing, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. His legs buckled beneath him and he collapsed onto his side, still making that horrible gurgling sound while his paws scraped uselessly against the grass. I remember screaming his name as I ran across the yard, my bare feet slipping on the morning dew. When I reached him, his eyes were rolling back, showing too much white, and his breathing came in these rapid, shallow bursts that seemed to shake his entire frame. I scooped all 70 pounds of him into my arms without thinking, carried him through the house leaving a trail of saliva and grass, and somehow got him into my car. The emergency vet clinic was 12 minutes away. I made it in 7. The waiting room at Brookside Animal Emergency was a blur of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell. A technician took Chester from my arms the moment I stumbled through the doors, and I stood there in the lobby with grass stains on my pajama pants and my hands still trembling from gripping the steering wheel so hard. They rushed him to the back, and I just kept staring at the swinging doors, trying to understand what had just happened. Chester had been perfectly fine the night before. We had played fetch in the backyard until the sun went down, and he had eaten his dinner with his usual enthusiasm. A vet named Dr. Holloway came out after what felt like hours, but was probably 40 minutes. Her expression careful and controlled. She told me Chester was stable but critical. They had induced vomiting and started him on activated charcoal, but they needed to run more tests. Then she asked me a question that stopped me cold. Had Chester been exposed to any rat poison recently? I told her no, absolutely not. I had never used rat poison in my life. I did not even have a rodent problem. Dr. Holloway nodded slowly, then explained that the preliminary blood work showed signs of anticoagulant toxicity, the kind caused by rodenticides. But here was the strange part, she said. The absorption pattern suggested Chester had not ingested the poison by eating it directly. The concentration was too even, too widespread across his system. It was more consistent with dermal absorption, meaning the poison had likely been on his skin, his paws, maybe his belly, and he had absorbed it through prolonged contact. She asked if Chester had rolled around in anything unusual, any strange substances in the yard. I kept shaking my head, my mind racing through every inch of my backyard, trying to think of anything that could explain this. Dr. Holloway looked at me with this expression I will never forget, part concern, part something darker, and said quietly that in her 20 years of practice, she had only seen this pattern once before. Someone had deliberately sprinkled poison onto grass where a dog played. I drove home in a daze, my mind refusing to process what I had just heard. The idea that someone would intentionally hurt Chester seemed impossible, absurd even. He was the friendliest dog in the world. He had never bitten anyone, never jumped on strangers, never caused any problems. But as I pulled into my driveway and sat there with the engine running, a name kept surfacing in my thoughts, like something rotten floating up from deep water. Howard Lacey, my neighbor to the east, the one whose property shared that long wooden fence with my backyard. Howard had moved in about 8 months after I did, a man in his late 50s with a permanent scowl and a habit of watching everything that happened on the street from his front porch. From the very first week, he had made it clear that he did not like Chester. He complained about barking that did not exist. Chester barely made a sound unless someone rang the doorbell. He complained about the smell, about dog hair supposedly blowing into his yard, about property values being affected by that animal. I got out of the car and walked around to my backyard, my eyes scanning every inch of grass near the fence line. The morning sun was fully up now and the dew had mostly dried, but I got down on my hands and knees anyway, searching for anything unusual. And then I found them. Small blue pellets, maybe a dozen of them, scattered in a rough line about 2 feet from the base of the fence on my side. They were partially dissolved, some of them just blue smears in the dirt, but a few were still intact enough to see their shape, little compressed cylinders that looked exactly like the rat poison you see at hardware stores. My chest tightened as I stared at them, calculating the distance from the fence to where Chester liked to lie down in the shade every morning. This was his spot. Whoever did this knew exactly where to put it. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of everything, the pellets, the fence, the exact location, before carefully collecting what remained into a plastic bag. Then I stood up, looked at Howard Lacey's house rising just beyond the fence, and felt something cold settle into my gut. My first instinct was to march over there and confront him right then, but something held me back. I had no proof it was Howard, just a gut feeling and a history of petty complaints. If I accused him without evidence, he could deny everything, maybe even twist it around and make me look like the unstable neighbor harassing an innocent man. So I forced myself to think strategically, even though every fiber of my being wanted to put my fist through his front door. I called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation as calmly as I could. The officer on the phone was sympathetic but clear. Without direct evidence linking a specific person to the poisoning, there was not much they could do. He suggested I file a report for documentation purposes, which I did, and he mentioned that I might want to consider installing security cameras. That last suggestion stuck with me. By noon that same day, I had ordered a weatherproof camera from an electronics store with same-day delivery. I spent the afternoon mounting it under the eave of my back porch, angled to capture a wide view of the backyard, and most importantly, that stretch of fence bordering Howard's property. That night, I barely slept. The vet clinic had called around 8 to say Chester was showing improvement. His blood was responding to the vitamin K treatment, and his vitals were stabilizing. I should have felt relieved, and part of me did, but a larger part was consumed by this simmering rage that kept me staring at the ceiling until 3 in the morning. I kept replaying every interaction I had ever had with Howard Lacey. The way he would glare at Chester through the fence slats whenever we were outside. The time he had left a passive-aggressive note in my mailbox about controlling your animal, after Chester had barked once, literally once, at a squirrel. The anonymous complaint to the HOA about alleged noise violations that went nowhere because there was no noise to begin with. Each memory felt different now, recontextualized by what had happened. These were not the actions of a grumpy neighbor who valued his peace and quiet. This was a pattern, a slow escalation that had been building towards something, and I had been too naive to see it coming. When my alarm went off at 5:30, I was already awake, already watching the camera feed on my phone, waiting to see if Howard would make another move. The sun had not even cleared the tree line when I saw him. At exactly 6:14 in the morning, according to the timestamp on the footage, Howard Lacey appeared at the fence. He was wearing a gray bathrobe and slippers, and he moved with this casual confidence that made my blood pressure spike just watching him. He looked around first, a slow, deliberate scan of the surroundings, and then he reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out a small plastic bottle, the kind you might use for travel-size shampoo. I watched in real time, my phone screen inches from my face as he leaned over the fence, extended his arm into my yard, and shook that bottle in a back-and-forth motion. Blue powder drifted down onto my grass like some kind of toxic snowfall. The whole thing took maybe 15 seconds. Then he pocketed the bottle, adjusted his robe, and walked back toward his house like he had just finished watering his plants. I sat there in my bed, the phone trembling in my grip, watching him disappear around the corner of his house. I had him. After everything he had put Chester through, I finally had proof of exactly what this man was capable of doing. I saved the footage to 3 different places, my phone, my laptop, and a cloud drive, before I did anything else. Then I called the police, the real number this time, not the non-emergency line. I explained what I had captured on camera and asked them to send an officer immediately. A patrol car arrived within 20 minutes, and I showed the deputy the video on my laptop screen. His name was Deputy Ramos, a stocky guy in his 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor, and I watched his expression shift from professional neutrality to genuine disgust as the footage played. He asked me to send him a copy, which I did right there on the spot, and then he asked if I wanted to accompany him next door to confront the individual in question. Part of me wanted to say yes, wanted to see Howard's face when he realized he had been caught, but a cooler part of my brain told me to stay back and let the law handle it. So I watched from my front window as Deputy Ramos walked up Howard's driveway, knocked on the door, and waited. Howard answered in that same gray bathrobe, and even from a distance I could see his posture change the moment he spotted the patrol car parked at the curb. Deputy Ramos spoke with Howard for about 10 minutes on his front porch. I could not hear what was being said, but I could read body language well enough. Howard started out with his arms crossed, shaking his head, the picture of indignant denial. Then Ramos must have mentioned the video, because Howard's whole demeanor shifted. His shoulders dropped, his hands fell to his sides, and he took a half-step backward like he had been physically pushed. A few more exchanges, and then Ramos was pulling out handcuffs. I watched Howard Lacey get arrested right there on his own front porch, still wearing that gray bathrobe, still in his slippers. A second patrol car arrived, and they put him in the back seat while a female officer walked around to knock on my door. She introduced herself as Officer Tate and asked if I could come down to the station later that day to give a formal statement. I agreed immediately. Before she left, she told me something that stuck with me. When they searched Howard's garage, they found 3 more bottles of the same rodenticide, along with a handwritten list of neighborhood nuisances that included my address, Chester's name, and a detailed log of every time my dog had supposedly barked over the past 6 months. The dates were meticulous. The times were precise down to the minute. None of it was real. I picked Chester up from the vet clinic that afternoon. He was weak and tired, his golden fur dull and matted in places, but his tail still wagged when he saw me walk through the door. Dr. Holloway said he would need weeks of vitamin K supplements and regular blood tests to make sure his clotting factors returned to normal, but she expected a full recovery. I carried him to the car again, this time gently, and drove home with him curled up on a blanket in the back seat. When we pulled into the driveway, I just sat there for a moment looking at my house, looking at the fence that separated my yard from Howard's empty property. He had been charged with felony animal cruelty and criminal poisoning, and according to Officer Tate, he was looking at serious prison time given the premeditated nature of what he had done. His house went up for sale 2 months later. I never found out what happened to him after the trial. I made a conscious decision not to follow that story any further. What I do know is that Chester healed, slowly but completely. I installed 2 more cameras around the property and replaced that old wooden fence with a 6-foot privacy barrier that nobody could lean over. And every morning when I let Chester out into the backyard, I still watch him from the kitchen window until he comes back inside. Some habits you just never shake. My family had been renting apartments for as long as I could remember, so when my parents finally saved enough for a down payment on an actual house, it felt like we had won some kind of lottery. I was 17 that summer, about to start my senior year, and the idea of having a backyard with a pool seemed almost unreal. We moved into a quiet neighborhood in a suburb outside of Denver, the kind of place where people waved at each other from their driveways and left their garage doors open during the day. The house was a split level with beige siding and a wooden deck that wrapped around to the back, overlooking a decent-sized yard, with an above-ground pool the previous owners had left behind. My younger brother Caleb, who was 13 at the time, immediately claimed the basement bedroom, while I got the room upstairs with a window facing the backyard. Everything about those first few days felt perfect, like we had finally landed somewhere we could call home for good. Our neighbor to the right was a man named Howard Lessing, probably somewhere in his late 50s, with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made his eyes look slightly too large. He lived alone in a 2-story colonial that had clearly seen better days, the paint peeling near the gutters and the lawn always just a little too long. My dad met him the day we moved in, and he seemed friendly enough, helping us carry a few boxes from the truck and making small talk about the neighborhood. He mentioned that he was retired from some kind of government job, though he never specified what exactly he had done. What I remember most from that first meeting was how he kept glancing toward me while talking to my parents, quick little looks that lasted maybe a second too long. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just being paranoid because he was a stranger, but something about the way he smiled at me, all teeth and no warmth in his eyes, made me want to go inside and lock the door behind me. The first week passed without incident, and I started to relax into our new life. I spent most of my days either unpacking boxes or floating in the pool, trying to squeeze every bit of summer out of the remaining weeks before school started. The weather that July was relentless, hitting triple digits almost every afternoon, so the pool became my refuge. I would lay out on a towel on the deck, put in my earbuds, and just let the sun bake away all the stress of moving. It was during one of those lazy afternoons that I first noticed Howard on his back deck. He was standing near the railing with a large camera, one of those professional-looking ones with a massive lens attached to the front. He seemed to be pointing it toward the trees at the edge of his property, adjusting the focus every few seconds. I figured he was one of those bird-watching types, maybe photographing cardinals or whatever else lived in suburban Colorado. I waved at him out of politeness, and he lowered the camera just long enough to wave back before returning to whatever he was shooting. Over the next several days, I started to notice a pattern. Every single time I went outside to swim or sunbathe, Howard would appear on his deck within 10 or 15 minutes, always with that same camera. At first, I thought it was just coincidence, that maybe he spent most of his day out there anyway, and I had never paid attention before. But then I started testing it. One afternoon, I went outside, stayed for 5 minutes, then went back in. I watched from my bedroom window, and sure enough, Howard came out onto his deck about 8 minutes after I had gone inside. He stood there for a moment, scanning the yard, then went back in when he saw I was not there. I tried it again the next day, same result. My heart started beating faster every time I saw that sliding glass door open, every time I heard the distant click, click, click of his camera shutter. I wanted to believe he was just a lonely old man with a hobby, but the timing was too perfect, too deliberate to be anything innocent. I brought it up to my mom one evening while she was cooking dinner, trying to keep my voice casual so she would not think I was overreacting. I told her about Howard and his camera, about how he always seemed to show up right when I went outside. She listened while stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce, her brow furrowing slightly as I explained. When I finished, she sighed and told me that he was probably just bored and lonely, that retired men often pick up hobbies like photography to fill their time. She reminded me that we were new to the neighborhood and should not start making accusations without proof. My dad, who was sitting at the kitchen table reading something on his phone, agreed with her. He said Howard seemed like a nice enough guy and that I was probably just not used to having neighbors so close. I wanted to argue, wanted to tell them that they did not see what I saw, but I knew they would not believe me without something concrete. So I dropped it, feeling more alone in my unease than I had before I even mentioned it. That Saturday, my dad decided to install a motion-activated security camera on our back deck. It was not because of Howard. He said it was just a smart thing to do for any new homeowner, especially with the sliding glass doors leading to the backyard. He set up the system so that any motion in the yard would send an alert to an app on his phone, along with a short video clip. I remember feeling a small wave of relief when he finished mounting it, thinking that, at least now, there would be some record if anything strange happened. The first few days of alerts were boring, just clips of squirrels running across the grass or birds landing on the edge of the pool. But then, on the 4th night after the camera was installed, my dad called me into the living room with a strange look on his face. He handed me his phone and told me to watch the video that had come in around 2 in the afternoon, when I had been out by the pool. The clip was only 15 seconds long, but what it showed made my throat tighten. There, attached to the wooden slat of our back fence, was a small black camera, a GoPro, angled directly at the spot where I always laid out my towel. My dad went outside immediately to check, and I followed close behind him, my legs feeling weak beneath me. We walked to the fence together, and there it was, a matte black GoPro Hero mounted with a small clamp to one of the horizontal slats. It was positioned low, maybe 3 feet off the ground, hidden behind a clump of ornamental grass that grew along the fence line. You would never notice it unless you were specifically looking for it, which is exactly what made it so disturbing. The camera was still recording when we found it, a tiny red light blinking on its side. My dad reached out and ripped it off the fence, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching beneath his skin. He turned the camera over in his hands, examining it like he could not quite believe what he was holding. There was no memory card inside. Whoever had placed it there must have been streaming the footage directly to another device. My dad looked at me, then looked toward the fence that separated our yard from Howard's property, and I watched the realization settle into his expression like a stone sinking into water. He told me to go inside and stay there while he went next door to talk to Howard. I did as he asked, but I positioned myself near the kitchen window where I could see the front of Howard's house. My dad walked up the driveway and knocked on the door, the GoPro still clutched in his right hand. Howard answered after maybe 30 seconds, and I watched them talk on the porch. From where I stood, I could not hear what they were saying, but I could see my dad holding up the camera and gesturing toward our yard. Howard shook his head repeatedly, his hands raised in what looked like a gesture of innocence. The conversation lasted about 5 minutes before my dad turned and walked back home, his face red and his stride heavy with frustration. When he came inside, he told us that Howard denied everything. He claimed he had never seen the camera before, that someone else must have put it there, maybe teenagers playing a prank. He even suggested that we should check with the other neighbors, implying that anyone could have accessed our fence from the alley behind the houses. My dad did not believe him, not for a second, but without concrete proof that Howard had placed the camera, there was nothing more we could do that night. The next morning, my dad filed a police report. 2 officers came to our house around noon, a man and a woman who looked like they had seen their share of neighborhood disputes. My dad showed them the GoPro, explained where we had found it, and told them about Howard and his constant presence on the deck with his camera. The officers listened patiently, took notes, and then explained the reality of the situation. Without proof that Howard specifically had placed the camera, fingerprints, video footage of him installing it, or a confession, there was not much they could do. They said they would go talk to him, document the incident, and keep it on file in case anything else happened. The female officer, whose name tag read Novak, pulled me aside before they left and asked if I felt safe. I told her I did not know anymore, that I used to feel safe in my own backyard, but now I could not even look out my window without wondering if someone was watching. She nodded like she understood, gave me her card, and told me to call if anything else happened. It was a small comfort, but it was something. That afternoon, I made a decision. I was not going to let Howard take away my summer, my sense of peace, my right to exist in my own space without being surveilled. I put on my swimsuit, grabbed a towel, and walked out to the backyard like I had done dozens of times before. But this time, I brought my phone with me, and I had the camera app open and ready. I laid out on the deck, pretending to scroll through social media, but really I was watching the fence line and Howard's deck through my peripheral vision. It took less than 10 minutes. His sliding glass door opened with that familiar scrape of metal on metal, and there he was, camera in hand, positioning himself at his usual spot on the railing. I waited until he raised the camera to his eye, until I could see the long lens pointed directly at me, and then I stood up and aimed my phone right back at him. I started recording, making sure to capture his face, his camera, the angle of his lens. He noticed almost immediately. For a moment he just stood there, frozen, the camera still raised. Then he lowered it slowly, his expression unreadable from that distance, and he turned and walked back inside without a word. I sent that video to Officer Novak that same evening, along with a detailed timeline of every incident I could remember. She called me back the next day and told me she had shown the footage to her supervisor, who agreed that it established a clear pattern of behavior. Combined with the GoPro we had found on our fence, they now had enough to pay Howard a more serious visit. I do not know exactly what was said during that conversation, but I do know that 2 days later, a moving truck appeared in Howard's driveway. He did not look at our house once while the movers loaded his furniture, his boxes, his life into the back of that truck. My mom, who had finally come around to believing me after seeing the video, stood at the window and watched him leave with a grim satisfaction on her face. My dad had already consulted with a lawyer about a restraining order, but it turned out we did not need it. Howard was gone within a week, and we never saw him again. I later learned from a neighbor down the street that he had moved out of state entirely, though nobody seemed to know where. It has been almost 2 years since that summer, and I still think about it more often than I would like. I finished high school, started community college, and tried to move on with my life like nothing had happened. But sometimes when I am sitting in my backyard or walking to my car at night, I catch myself scanning the windows of nearby houses, looking for the glint of a lens or the shadow of a figure watching. I never found out what Howard did with the footage he collected, whether it existed on some hard drive somewhere or had been uploaded to corners of the internet I do not want to imagine. The police never recovered anything from his house, By the time they had enough to search, he was already gone. What stays with me most is not the fear itself, but the way it crept in so quietly, disguised as something harmless. A man with a camera, a hobby, a friendly wave across the fence. I learned that summer that the most dangerous people are not the ones who look dangerous. They are the ones who blend in, who smile at your parents, who make you doubt your own instincts until it is almost too late. I trust my gut now. I wish I had trusted it sooner. The duplex where I lived back then sat on a quiet, dead-end street, the kind where porch lights stayed on more for habit than need. My place was small but comfortable, and my routine was predictable. Early mornings at work, evenings tinkering with small woodworking projects in the kitchen. The neighbor on the other side kept mostly to himself. I barely knew his name, only that he worked irregular hours and never seemed to have visitors. What first caught my attention were the sounds. Slow, dragging thuds coming from outside well past midnight. At first I assumed he was rearranging something in his yard, but the timing felt strange enough for me to start paying more attention. Over the next few weeks, those late-night noises returned like clockwork. Whenever I peered through my blinds, I'd catch glimpses of him hauling heavy contractor bags from his back door toward the fence. The bags sagged in a way that suggested something dense was inside, and he carried them with a stiff, purposeful grip. The way he moved reminded me of someone following a plan rather than dealing with random chores. One night I leaned closer to the window and noticed how he paused before every trip, scanning the yard as if checking for witnesses. Something about that careful routine stirred a quiet unease in me, the kind that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. Little later, a chemical smell began drifting between our yards. It had a sharp bite to it, the sort of odor you'd expect from paint thinner mixed with burnt plastic. It showed up randomly, sometimes at dawn, sometimes around dinner, and lingered longer than made sense. I tried mentioning it casually to another neighbor across the street, and she told me she'd been smelling it too, especially on humid nights when the air felt thick. She joked that maybe he was starting some kind of home renovation, but there was no laughter behind it. People had begun closing their windows earlier, even on breezy evenings that usually felt perfect outside. Then came the night I actually saw him digging. I stepped into my kitchen for water and noticed movement near the fence. He was crouched low, carving out a narrow trench beside a row of bushes. He worked fast, almost frantically, pushing dirt aside with sharp shovels full. When the motion light snapped on above my back door, he jerked upright and swept something into the hole with his sleeve before packing the soil back down. He kept glancing toward my windows while smoothing the ground with his palms, leaving the surface oddly level, as if he'd rehearsed that exact motion. I remember standing there, glass in hand, feeling this sinking awareness that whatever he was doing, he didn't want anyone seeing it. A few mornings after that digging incident, the chemical smell hit harder than before. So sharp it clung to the back of my throat. I stepped outside to check if something had spilled near my place, but the odor clearly drifted from his side of the fence. That's when I noticed small scorch-like patches in the grass near where he'd been working, as if something had leaked and eaten through the blades. The rest of the yard was normal, but those patches stood out like bruises on the ground. I remember thinking about whether I should report it, but there was nothing concrete to point to. Just smells, noises, and glimpses through blinds. Still, something in the air felt charged, like the tension right before a storm breaks. Around that time, the landlord sent out a message about a routine pest inspection scheduled for the end of the week. It wasn't unusual. He did it every year, but the timing couldn't have been worse for my neighbor. The next evening, as I pulled into the driveway, I saw him standing beside a rental truck, one of those medium-sized box trucks with faded decals, the kind people use when they're in a hurry to move. He was stuffing more contractor bags inside, tossing them with a speed that didn't match the calm expression he kept forcing onto his face. Even from a distance, his movements looked jittery, like he couldn't get the truck loaded fast enough. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't nod. Didn't do anything except rush back and forth between his door and the truck. That night, well past midnight, the sounds returned, but this time they were sharper, more desperate. Instead of the steady thuds I'd grown accustomed to, I heard scraping, dragging, and the clatter of something metallic hitting concrete. The rental truck's rear door slammed again and again. Every time I tried to peek outside, he was either disappearing behind the truck or rushing into the duplex with an empty dolly. The whole street was silent except for him, and each noise cut through the air like it didn't belong in a neighborhood at that hour. There was this prickling awareness in me, a sense that something was nearing its end. Whatever he'd been doing, he was trying to erase it before the inspection. By sunrise, the truck was gone, completely. No trace of it except for faint tire marks on the pavement. The yard was quiet. The air smelled like nothing. It felt almost eerie how abruptly everything had stopped, as if someone had flipped a switch. For the first time in weeks, there were no dragging sounds, no hovering chemical scent creeping across the fence. I walked out back later that afternoon and noticed the soil near the bushes looked uneven again, but not freshly dug, more like something heavy had pressed into it. Shallow depressions ran in a line along the fence, subtle but definitely there. When I crouched closer, the dirt seemed disturbed in a patterned way, as if things had been buried and then hastily removed. The pest inspector arrived 2 days later, a quiet man named Fletcher with a clipboard and a pair of boot covers he slipped on before stepping indoors. He didn't mention anything unusual as he moved through my place, but when he went next door, he paused on the front porch for a long moment. The neighbor's unit was completely empty, doors open, blinds drawn up halfway, and a faint echo drifting out as if the walls had just been stripped bare. Fletcher walked through slowly, peering along the baseboards and checking cabinets, but he eventually returned, shaking his head, saying the place felt hollow. After he left, the landlord stopped by briefly, muttering about an early termination of the lease and unpaid fees, though he didn't seem too surprised. People came and went in that building often, but something about this departure unsettled him more than he admitted. Over the next week, the yard began to change in a way I couldn't ignore. The depressions along the fence grew more pronounced, almost like the ground was settling from the inside out. I tried brushing my shoe over one of them, expecting it to feel firm, but the soil shifted under the surface, soft in a way that didn't match the surrounding earth. A stray dog from down the street wandered into my yard one afternoon and started pawing at one of the spots, digging with this frantic enthusiasm animals get when they've picked up a scent. I had to shoo it away, but the claw marks it left behind revealed darker soil beneath, packed in uneven layers that didn't look natural. Seeing that patch exposed stirred something uneasy deep in my gut. News among the neighbors traveled quickly. Everyone had heard the late-night noises. Everyone had smelled the chemical fumes. And now everyone had their own theory. Some whispered about hazardous waste. Others pointed out the scorch patches in the grass and suggested he'd been burning something he shouldn't. A few people even wondered aloud if the bags he carried held something more disturbing. The landlord considered calling in a soil test, but after a few days of silence, he backed out, claiming the cost wouldn't be worth it unless someone filed a formal complaint. No one wanted to be the one to sign their name on that kind of paperwork. Fear hung over the street in a quiet, unspoken way. Nobody wanted answers badly enough to risk what they might find. Eventually, life settled back into its usual rhythm, but the yard never really looked the same. Every time I stepped outside, those indentations drew my attention like they were waiting for someone to acknowledge them. I never dug them up. Part of me felt I should, but another part insisted that whatever had been there was better left undisturbed. The neighbor never returned, not even to collect stray mail that piled up for weeks before the landlord finally tossed it. Sometimes on warm nights when the breeze shifts just right, I swear there's still a hint of that chemical odor drifting through the fence line. Faint, but unmistakable. I've moved since then, but the memory of those late-night bags and the silent panic behind that rushed departure stays with me. And the truth is, whatever he was hiding back there, I don't think anyone was meant to uncover it. Moving into that upstairs apartment felt like a reset I desperately needed. Work was steady, my schedule was predictable, and living on my own again gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in a long time. The building was older, the kind with narrow staircases and vents that hummed faintly at night, but it suited me. I remember unpacking that first weekend, humming along to music, trying to make the place feel like mine. The only thing that caught my attention early on was the downstairs neighbor's bass, deep, heavy, and always past midnight. I didn't think much of it at first. People have habits, and I wasn't trying to be difficult. When I finally knocked on his door and asked, as politely as I could, if he could lower it after midnight, he just stared through the crack like he was studying the shape of my voice. He didn't say yes, didn't say no, just closed the door slowly, as though testing how long I'd stand there. The next morning, stepping out for work, I found my welcome mat slashed straight down the middle. The cut was so clean it made me stop for a few seconds just to understand what I was looking at. The mat wasn't expensive, but it was personal. I'd brought it from my old place because it reminded me of home. Seeing it destroyed right at my doorway instantly felt targeted. I kept replaying our interaction from the night before, wondering if my request somehow came across as rude. I even checked the hallway camera at the end of the corridor, only to realize it had been unplugged, the cord coiled neatly beside it. That detail bothered me more than the slashed mat. Someone had gone out of their way to make sure nothing was recorded, and in that building, only a handful of tenants knew where that camera was plugged in. A couple of days later, while getting ready for bed, I heard footsteps downstairs. Not unusual in an apartment building, but these were different. They didn't move in a straight line or sound like someone walking naturally. They paced, slow, deliberate steps that shifted direction whenever I did. If I moved toward the kitchen, the footsteps followed along the floor beneath it. If I stopped, they stopped. I stood still for a long minute, listening, hoping it was just pipes contracting or settling, but the pattern was unmistakable. The footsteps were tracking me. I tried brushing it off as paranoia, but the sound had a weight to it, like someone dragging their feet with purpose, matching my movements with eerie accuracy. That night, at around 3 a.m., a soft knocking started at my door, gentle enough to sound hesitant, but persistent enough to keep me awake. No voice followed it. No shifting shadows under the door, just the rhythmic, quiet tapping of someone who knew exactly how to keep a person on edge. Filing a complaint with management felt like the only reasonable thing to do. I explained the noises, the slashed mat, and the knocking, hoping they'd talk to the neighbor or at least check the maintenance logs. Instead, what I got was retaliation I couldn't have imagined. That evening, while I was eating dinner, recordings of my own conversations started playing from the apartment below. My voice crystal clear, repeating ordinary things I'd said while on the phone earlier that day. The sound came through the vents, echoing upward in a warped, hollow way. I remember standing in the middle of my living room, heart racing, suddenly aware of every vent and grate in the place. I didn't even know the units shared ventilation, let alone that someone could use them like a listening system. The worst part wasn't hearing my own words. It was realizing he had chosen what to play. He picked moments where I sounded distracted or tired, as if mocking how unaware I'd been. A few days later, when I walked out to my car before work, I noticed a jagged reflection streaking across the driver's side door. At first I thought it was just dirt catching the sunlight in a weird way. But the closer I got, the clearer it became. Someone had keyed the entire side of my car, carving a message so deeply the metal curled at the edges. I hear everything. The letters were uneven, almost frantic, like whoever did it couldn't control their pressure. My first instinct was to look around the lot, half expecting someone to be watching, but the place was silent except for a distant lawnmower. I felt exposed standing there, as if stepping into my car made me part of some sick game he thought we were playing. I reported it to the landlord and the police, but without cameras or witnesses. They told me there wasn't much they could do besides take note of it. Hearing that made my skin crawl in a way I can still remember. Someone was escalating, and I was the only one who seemed to understand that. The pacing under the floors didn't stop. It grew bolder. Instead of following me only in the evening, It started the moment I got home from work. Heavy steps pressed upward from the wood, slow and methodical, making the floorboards tremble just slightly under my feet. Sometimes it sounded like he was dragging something beneath me, something coarse scraping against the subfloor. I learned the exact rhythm of his movements, the pauses he took, the way he seemed to wait for me to step into a specific spot before continuing. It reached a point where I avoided certain areas of my own apartment because standing over them felt like leaning too close to a stranger's ear. Nights became impossible. The soft knocking at 3 a.m. never stopped. It only grew more confident, almost impatient, tapping in quick bursts like he expected me to answer. One evening, while lying in bed and trying to ignore the faint shuffling beneath the floor, I heard something new. An exhale. A long, shaky breath rising through the cracks in the floorboards directly under my bed. It didn't sound like it came through a vent. It sounded like someone was right beneath me, separated by nothing but wood and a few inches of darkness. I sat up slowly, barely breathing, listening to the faint rasp of air pushing upward. I slid out of bed and grabbed my phone, shining the flashlight across the floor, scanning for any sign of movement. The boards looked normal, untouched, but the breathing continued until I stepped away from the mattress. Then it stopped completely, replaced by the faintest creak, like weight shifting on hands and knees. That was the moment I realized he wasn't just listening, he was moving through the crawl space directly under my room. I confronted the landlord again the next morning, practically begging them to inspect the crawl space, or at least check the locks on the maintenance access. They insisted it was sealed, that no tenant had access to it, and brushed off my claims as old building noises amplified by stress. I even showed them the message scraped into my car, but they seemed more worried about liability than my safety. That night, I pushed my bed toward the opposite corner of the room, away from the area where I'd heard the breathing. It didn't help. The shuffling returned, louder than before, and this time it traveled the full length of the room, stopping under every corner where furniture had been moved. It felt like he was mapping the space, testing how close he could get to each wall and piece of furniture. At one point, a sharp crack jolted through the floor like a board giving under pressure. I remember whispering out loud, asking whoever was down there what they wanted. Of course, there was no answer, just the slow retreat of movement sliding back into the dark. 2 nights later, I caught the first clear sign that he was no longer satisfied with staying beneath the floor. At around 2 a.m., I heard a subtle but steady thumping inside the wall near my bedroom door, too rhythmic to be plumbing, too deliberate to be settling wood. It traveled vertically, like someone climbing between the studs. I walked into the hallway and pressed my ear gently to the drywall, and there it was again, a faint scritching, followed by another thump, then a dragging sound moving upward. The space between those walls wasn't wide enough for a person, at least not comfortably, yet the noises fit the size of someone determined enough to squeeze through anything. When the thumping reached eye level, I stepped back instinctively. A small puff of drywall dust drifted out of a barely visible gap at the baseboard, as if the pressure from inside had forced it loose. That was when I grabbed my bag and slept in my car, because whatever line he'd been creeping toward, he had finally crossed it. The next morning, after barely sleeping, I returned to the apartment with a maintenance worker who reluctantly agreed to check the crawlspace and walls. He unlocked the panel behind the laundry room, a panel I hadn't known existed, and the smell that drifted out was stale and metallic, like rust mixed with something sour. He shined his flashlight inside, and I held my breath waiting for him to confirm what I already feared. The beam revealed flattened insulation, scattered food wrappers, and deep indentations in the dust where someone had clearly been crawling on elbows and knees. The worker didn't say much. He just muttered that the access had been tampered with, and that he'd report it. But what unsettled me most wasn't the trail. It was the imprint of a palm near the opening, pressed so hard into the dust that every crease was visible, as if whoever made it paused there often listening. That evening I started packing without telling anyone. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing the deposit. I just wanted distance from that building. While taking a last box to my car, I noticed movement in the downstairs window, the faint outline of a man standing perfectly still behind the curtains. I couldn't make out his face, but the shape of his body didn't shift, not even slightly. It was as if he'd been waiting the whole time for me to look in his direction. I turned away quickly and kept walking, but a soft tapping started behind the glass, barely audible from outside. It wasn't aggressive. It was the same slow rhythm I'd heard at my door at 3 a.m., like he wanted me to know he recognized the moment I decided to leave. My legs felt weak as I reached the car, but leaving was the only thing that made sense. I drove to a friend's place across town and refused to go back alone. By the end of that week, I had moved out completely. I didn't retrieve the final few items left in the kitchen cabinets, didn't check the mail slot one last time. None of it felt worth stepping back inside. Months later, the landlord called to say the downstairs tenant had disappeared, left everything behind. According to him, the crawl space had been resealed and the unit was safe again, said with a tone that made it clear he wanted me to consider returning. I never did. Every so often, though, I still think about those footsteps tracing my movements, the recordings of my voice echoing through the vents, and the breathing rising through the floor in the middle of the night. I don't know what he was planning to do once he found a way in. Maybe nothing. Maybe something worse. All I know is that leaving saved me from ever finding out. Most of that year had been pretty uneventful for me. I was working long shifts at a small print shop, keeping to myself, and trying to save enough money to move out of the old apartment building I'd been stuck in for far too long. The place wasn't dangerous, just worn out. Thin walls, flickering hallway lights, and a constant smell of burnt toast drifting up from a unit downstairs. Around that time, one of my neighbors, a quiet guy named Evan, lived right across the hall from me. He wasn't the type who made small talk, but he'd nod whenever we passed each other. For months, he'd been predictable in a comfortable way. Same gray jacket, same beat-up sedan parked in the same corner spot, same routine of leaving early and returning late. Nothing about him ever stood out, until one week when everything about him changed. It began with the cameras. I remember unlocking my door and noticing a small black device mounted above Evan's doorframe, angled strangely, not toward the hallway like a normal security measure, but pointed inward, facing his own door as if he expected something to come from inside. Later that day, another one appeared, this time lower, almost at knee height, also aimed directly at his door. The whole setup felt backwards, like he was trying to see who might approach from behind him rather than from the hallway. When he walked past me that evening, he practically jumped even though I barely moved. His eyes darted around as if he were tracking invisible threats, and when he reached the parking lot, he didn't go to his usual spot. He circled the entire lot twice before choosing a space nowhere near the building. Over the next couple of days, his behavior grew more jittery. He'd pause at his door before unlocking it, pressing his ear against the wood as if listening for movement inside. Anytime someone stepped into the hallway, he reacted like the air had suddenly shifted, shoulders tight, gaze locked forward, pretending not to notice anyone walking behind him. One afternoon, I came home early and saw him swapping out one of the cameras for an even smaller one, something almost hidden against the trim. His hands moved quickly, like he'd done it 100 times, but his breathing sounded uneven. He didn't even acknowledge me. Instead, he muttered something under his breath, just a few scrambled words I couldn't make out, and slipped back inside. Things escalated late one night when I woke to frantic voices echoing through the hallway. Not shouting exactly, but hurried and intense, like people trying to keep an argument contained. I cracked my door open just enough to see several men standing outside Evan's apartment. They weren't dressed in uniforms, but something about the way they moved felt coordinated. Heads tilted the same way, backs straight, scanning the hallway with short, sharp glances. They knocked on Evan's door and called him a name I'd never heard before, a name that didn't sound even remotely similar to Evan. Their voices carried a strange mix of impatience and certainty, like they knew he was inside. When one of them spotted me watching, the entire group went silent. They didn't threaten me, didn't say a word. They just stepped back, exchanged looks, and vanished down the stairwell so quickly it barely felt real. By the next morning, the hallway felt different, emptier somehow, as if the night had peeled something away. I knocked gently on Evan's door before leaving for work, more out of concern than curiosity, but the sound echoed without any response. When I came back that afternoon, the cameras were gone. Not just removed, but completely stripped away, leaving faint outlines where the adhesive had been. Through the crack beneath his door, I no longer saw the thin line of light he usually kept on. The place felt hollow. The following day confirmed it. Movers carried out the last of his belongings in silence, and by evening the apartment stood entirely bare. No furniture, no bags, no stray items forgotten in a rush, just a spotless, empty unit that looked as if no one had lived there at all. The building should have settled back into its usual rhythms after that, but it didn't. 2 nights after Evan's sudden disappearance, a strange metallic sound woke me up, something like someone testing a doorknob with the patience of a lockpicker. I sat up, listening. It wasn't my door, it came from across the hall. Footsteps moved slowly, deliberately, stopping and starting in irregular intervals. I opened my peephole just enough to see 3 silhouettes in the hallway. These weren't the same men from before. Their posture, their clothing, even their presence felt different. Less organized, more restless. One of them knelt by Evan's old door while another drifted toward the mailboxes, inspecting each lock with an unsettling calm. At first, I thought they might be new tenants who'd gotten the wrong unit, but they carried no bags, no papers, nothing that suggested they belonged there. They didn't speak to each other either. Every movement seemed purposeful, as if they had instructions they didn't need to repeat out loud. The one at the door pressed his ear against it, not in a curious way, but like someone confirming whether a long-lost echo still lived behind the wood. When he pulled back, he tried the handle slowly, deliberately, before giving a small shake of his head. Then all 3 drifted down the hallway, not together exactly, but keeping the same slow, steady pace as they descended the stairs. Their visits didn't stop after that night. They came again the next, and again the one after. Always late, always quiet. Sometimes it was just one person lingering near the vacant unit, other times 2 or 3. A couple of them returned to the mailboxes and checked each slot carefully, tapping the locks as though listening for a specific sound only they understood. Once I heard someone whisper a word, too soft to catch, but the tone carried the weight of recognition, like whatever name they were using still mattered to them. It became obvious they weren't looking for an apartment. They were looking for him, still convinced he might be hiding somewhere close. The longer this went on, the more I felt the building shifting under it. People who had lived there for years suddenly kept their doors locked at all times, even in the daytime. Conversations in the stairwell stopped the moment these strangers appeared, as if the entire place had quietly agreed not to draw attention. I caught glimpses of them moving through the parking lot too, checking cars, pausing at empty spaces, scanning the rows like they were matching something against a memory. Sometimes one of them would linger near the tree by the sidewalk, looking up at the windows with a blank sort of focus, not searching the building exactly, but marking it, as if making sure it hadn't changed since the last time they came. What unnerved me most was how they treated the empty apartment across the hall. They acted like it was still occupied, still important, still holding something they needed to confirm or retrieve. One night I heard a soft scrape from their side of the hallway, like someone running a fingertip along the door frame, tracing the outline of where the cameras had once been. The sound stretched on long enough that I had to press a hand against my own chest to steady myself. Every instinct said not to open my door. The hallway lights flickered during their visits too, but not in the usual dying bulb kind of way. It was more like the lights dimmed just slightly whenever they passed beneath them, as though their presence disrupted something delicate in the wiring. On the 5th night, I heard footsteps stop directly in front of my door, not the tentative kind, not the sort that fumble looking for a number. They paused with intention. I stayed completely still, listening to breaths that were too controlled, too measured. Then came the softest tap against my doorknob. Not a twist, not a push, just a touch, like someone testing whether I would respond. I didn't move. After a few seconds, the footsteps shifted back toward the empty unit. A man's voice murmured something low, followed by a faint reply from farther down the hall. Their footsteps drifted away in no real hurry, as if they had all the time in the world to keep circling back. Eventually, I realized that waiting for them to stop wasn't a plan. It was just me hoping the problem would solve itself. So the next morning, I told the building manager everything. Every late-night visit, every door check, every time someone lingered by the mailboxes. She frowned like she wanted to dismiss it, but couldn't. By that afternoon, she'd installed new hallway cameras and scheduled a full lock replacement for every unit on the floor. The strange visits didn't stop immediately, but they changed. The strangers returned once more, looked straight at the new cameras, and left without touching a single door. After that, they were gone. No more footsteps at night. No more tapping on doorknobs. No more figures drifting in the parking lot. Evan never came back, and nobody who moved in after him stayed longer than a month, but the hallway finally went quiet again,